Open-coopetition. In R&D management and systems development, open-coopetition or open-coopetition is a neologism to describe cooperation among competitors in the open-source arena. The term was first coined by the scholars Jose Teixeira and Tingting to describe how rival firms that, while competing with similar products in the same markets, for example, Apple, Samsung, Google, Nokia, collaborate with each other in the development of open-source projects, for example, Webkit. Open-coopetition is a compound word term bridging coopetition and open source. Coopetition refers to a paradoxical relationship between two or more actors simultaneously involved in cooperative and competitive interactions, and open source both as a development method that emphasizes transparency and collaboration, and as a private collective innovation model with features both from the private investment and collective action. Firms contribute towards the creation of public goods while giving up associated intellectual property rights such patents, copyright, licenses, or trade secrets. Such intertwined behavior of cooperation and competition in an open-source way emphasizes transparency on the development of technological artifacts that become available to the public under an open-source license, allowing anyone to freely obtain, study, modify and redistribute them. Within open coopetition, development transparency and sense of community are maximized, while the managerial control and IP enforcement are minimized. Open competitive relationships are paradoxical as the core managerial concepts of property, contract and price play an outlier role. The openness characteristic of open-source projects also distinguishes open coopetition from other forms of cooperative arrangements by its inclusiveness. Everybody can contribute. Users or other contributors do not need to hold a supplier contract or sign a legal intellectual property arrangement to contribute. Moreover, neither to be a member of a particular firm or affiliated with a particular joint venture or consortia to be able to contribute. In the words of Massimo Bansi, you don't need anyone's permission to make something great. History. 2008. In a large-scale study involving multiple European-based software-intensive firms, the scholars Paraga Falk and Brian Fitzgerald revealed a shift from open source as a community of individual developers to open source as a community of commercial organizations, primarily small and medium-sized enterprises, operating as a symbiotic ecosystem in a spirit of coopetition. Even if they were exploring open sourcing as a novel and unconventional approach to global sourcing and coopetition, they captured the following quote that highlights that competition in the open source arena is not as in business as usual. 2012. Also in the academic world, and after following a software company based in Norway for over 5 years, and while theorizing on the concept of software ecosystem, the academic Geir K. Hansen noted that the characteristic networks of a software ecosystem, open source or proprietary ones, can embed competing organizations. In an opinion article entitled Open Source Coopetition Fueled by Linux Foundation Growth, the journalist and market analyst Jay Lyman highlights that working with direct rivals may have been unthinkable 10 years ago, but Linux, open source and organizations such as the Linux Foundation have highlighted how solving common problems and easing customer pain and friction in using and choosing different technologies can truly drive innovation and traction in the market. The term open source coopetition was employed to highlight the role of the Linux Foundation as a mediator of collaboration among rival firms. 2013. At the OpenStack Summit in Hong Kong, the co-founder of Mirantis Boris Rinsky talked about his job on figuring out how to cooperate in the crowded OpenStack open source community. In a 43-minute broadcast video, Boris Rinsky shed some light on OpenStack coopetition politics and shared a subjective view on strategies of individual players within the OpenStack community, e.g., Rackspace, Mirantis, IBM, HP and Red Hat among others. The Mirantis co-founder provided a rich description of an open-source community working in coopetition. Along with this lines, the pioneering scholarly work of German Press et al. 2013, reported on how key business actors within the financial services industry that traditionally viewed open-source software with skepticism, tied up an open-source community of competitors. By taking the case of OpenMoma, a middleware-agnostic messaging API used by some of the world's largest financial players, they show that corporate market rivals, for example, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, IBM and BMC, can coexist in open-source communities, and intentionally coordinate activities or mutual benefits in precise, market-focused, and non-differentiating engagements. Their work pointed out that high competitive capital-oriented industries do not epitomize the traditional and grassroots idea that open-source software was originally born from. Furthermore, they argued that open-source communities can be deliberately designed to include competing vendors and customers under neutral institutional structures, e.g., foundations and steering committees. 2014. In an academic paper entitled Collaboration in the Open Source Arena, the Webkit case, the scholars Jose Teixeira and Tingting executed an ethnographic-informed social network analysis on the development of the Webkit open-source web browsing technologies. Among a set of the reported findings, they pointed out that even if Apple and Samsung were involved in expensive patent wars in the courts at the time, they still collaborated in the open-source arena. As some of the research results did not confirm prior research in coopetition, the authors proposed and coined the open coopetition term while emphasizing the openness of collaborating with competitors in the open source arena. 2015. By turning to OpenStack, the scholars Teixeira et al. 2015, went further and modeled and analyzed both collaborative and competitive networks from the OpenStack open source project, a large and complex cloud computing infrastructure for big data. Somewhat surprising results point out that competition for the same revenue model, i.e., operating conflicting business models, does not necessarily affect collaboration within the OpenStack ecosystem. In other words, competition among firms did not significantly influence collaboration among software developers affiliated with them. Furthermore, the expected social tendency of developers to work with developers from same firm, i.e., homophily, did not hold within the OpenStack ecosystem. The case of OpenStack revealed to be much about genuine collaboration in software development besides ubiquitous competition among the firms that produce and use the software. 2016. A related study by Lineker et al. 2016, analyzed the Apache Hadoop ecosystem in a quantitative longitudinal case study to investigate changing stakeholder influence and collaboration patterns. They found that the collaborative network had a quite stable number of network components, i.e., number of subcommunities within the community, with many unconnected stakeholders. Furthermore, such components were dominated by a core set of stakeholders that engaged in most of the collaborative relationships. As in OpenStack, there was much cooperation among competing and non-competing actors within the Apache Hadoop ecosystem, or in other words, firms with competing business models collaborate as openly as non-rivaling firms. Finally, they also argued that the openness of software ecosystems decreases the distance to competitors within the same ecosystem. It becomes possible and important to track what the competitors do within. Knowing about their existing collaborations, contributions, and interests in specific features offer valuable information about the competitors' strategies and tactics. In a study addressing coopetition in the cloud computing industry, Teixeira et al. Analyzed not only coopetition among individuals and organizations but also among cohesive inter-organizational networks. Relationships among individuals were modeled and visualized in 2D longitudinal visualizations, and relationships among inter-organizational networks, for example, alliances, consortium or ecosystem, were modeled and visualized in 3D longitudinal visualizations. The author added evidence to prior research suggesting that competition is a multi-level phenomenon that is influenced by individual level, organizational level, and network level factors. By noting that many firms engaging into open coopetition actively manage multiple portfolios of alliances in the software industry, i.e., Many strategically contribute to multiple open-source software ecosystems, and by analyzing the co-evolution of OpenStack and the CloudStack cloud computing platforms, the same authors propose that development transparency and the weak intellectual property rights, two well-known characteristics of open-source ecosystems, allow an easier transfer of information and resources from one alliance to another. Even if openness enables a focal firm to transfer information and resources more easily between multiple alliances, such ease of transfer should not be seen as a source of competitive advantage, as competitors can do the same. 2017. In a study explicitly addressing co-opetition in open-source software ecosystems, Winduck et al. 2017 identified a number of situations in which different actors within the software ecosystem deal with collaborative competitive issues. Competitive behavior within open-source software ecosystems frictions with the more purist view of free and open-source software. The same authors reported on some working practices that conflict with the more traditional values of free and open-source software. The same study also unfolded a number of benefits that organization can reap by actively contributing to open-source software ecosystems that encompass both cooperative and competitive relationships. Cases of open coopetition are recurrent in the software industry in general. Furthermore, some cases exist also in the electronics, semiconductors, automotive, financial, telecommunications, retail, education, healthcare, defense, aerospace, and additive manufacturing industries. Cases of open coopetition are often associated with high-tech corporations and startups based in the USA, predominantly on the West Coast. Cases can be also recognized in Cuba, Brazil, Europe, predominantly on Western Europe, India, South Korea, China, Vietnam, Australia, and Japan. Many of the software projects encompassing open coopetition are legally governed by foundations such as the Linux Foundation, the Free Software Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and the X.org Foundation, among many others. Most of the Linux Foundation collaborative projects are competitive in nature. The Linux Foundation claims to be a neutral home for collaborative development. Furthermore, many competitive open-source projects dealing with both software and hardware, for example, computer graphics, data storage, are bounded by standard organizations such as the Khronos Group, W3C, and the Open Compute Project. Software-intensive domains. Beyond software,